A deadly Russian missile blitz has hit the British Council in Kyiv and the European Union office in a flagrant escalation by Moscow, which has left at least 14 people dead, including 3 children. Ukraine has hit back with a targeted strike against a Russian missile ship in the Sea of Azov. Kyiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news from the war in Ukraine. Overnight, a huge Russian missile and drone bombardment across the country, but focusing heavily on Kyiv. Some 629 missiles and drones fired at targets across the country, but focused heavily on the capital, Kyiv. There were 598 Shahed-style drones, including decoys, according to Ukraine's Air Force. 31 missiles, at least two of which were Russia's Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, a number of Iskander-M ballistic missiles, and air-launched Kh-101s. Shocking CCTV footage captured in the capital, Kyiv, shows the moment one of those missiles hit home, sending a mushroom cloud billowing into the sky over Ukraine's capital and devastating buildings for many blocks around. The European Union has responded angrily to the damage done to its building, saying this shows Vladimir Putin, this shows Russia is mocking peace efforts and showing that this is Russia's real response to Donald Trump's peace efforts. The strikes overnight came just hours after footage emerged of Britain's 2 top military officers visiting the capital to meet President Zelensky and pledge the UK's unwavering support. Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, who's the outgoing Chief of Defence Staff, visited Ukraine with his successor, Air Marshal Sir Richard Knighton, to make the point to Zelensky that the United Kingdom's support was not based on personalities. Clearly, Radakin and Zelensky and Radakin and the head of Ukraine's armed forces have had very good working relationships. They were making the point that this relationship will endure with that handover. This morning, Ukraine's military intelligence agency, the GUR, has released drone footage of what appears to be a double drone strike against a Russian corvette, the Buyan M, in the Sea of Azov. Really stark contrast to what we've seen Russia doing, which is sort of indiscriminate and massive missile attacks across civilian areas. Ukraine showing its ability to target very precisely Russian military targets. 2 drones not sinking that ship, but according to the GUR military intelligence, damaging the vessel's radar and also damaging its missile launchers, effectively neutering it, rendering it useless from a military point of view, and they said the vessel then retreated out of the area of operations. Not clear exactly when that strike took place. The footage was released this morning. That vessel may have been involved in exactly the sort of strikes that we've just been describing had it not been disabled by Ukraine. That was on the 28th. We saw that footage. A couple of days before that, we've also seen evidence of a strike on the Ryazan-Moscow fuel pipeline. Fits that pattern we've talked about lots before, but this is a pipeline sending fuel products to Moscow. A huge explosion burning for many, many hours, and reports from inside Russia that the use of that pipeline has now been suspended indefinitely. This week, Reuters has reported that Ukraine's campaign to degrade Russia's refining and oil storage capabilities has actually reduced by some 17% Russia's ability to refine crude oil. And we've talked before about that is having an effect on Russia's economy, on its export opportunities to bring in revenue, and causing huge fuel price surges at the pumps for ordinary Russians. One other story to talk about today is a particularly horrific account that a Ukrainian survivor has given of torture and the murder of his comrades. This was a man identified only as Vladislav, who was part of Ukraine's National Guard, who was captured earlier this month during a chaotic retreat from Pokrovsk as Russian forces were advancing. He said the brigade he was with lost control of a position. He'd been sent to help fellow Ukrainian forces but was captured. He said he and 7 other men were led into a basement where Russian soldiers dismembered, tortured one of his comrades. The first man, he said, this is really unpleasant, but had his lips, his ears, his nose and his penis cut off, his eyes gouged out before he was killed. The other men were then killed, and the man who gave this account says his throat was cut by his captors, who thought that they had killed him and then threw him into a pit. He waited till darkness, he said, and he told this story by writing it down because he's still unable to speak, and then began to crawl out, trying to staunch his injury with scraps of his own uniform. He claims it took him 5 days to reach the safety of Ukrainian lines, when he was then rushed to a hospital in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, where surgeons have operated to save his life. It is extraordinary. It's been reported widely by the Ukrainian media. I mean, it's so extraordinary, it's almost hard to believe. But we do know from human rights and war crimes investigators that Russia is suspected of murdering at least 273 prisoners of war. And there's been such an uptick in evidence of those murders, many of which have been filmed by Ukrainian drones, that Ukrainians have claimed that this has become a deliberate policy of the Russian armed forces. A reminder, I think, really, though, of the way that the brutal conditions that people endure, that the risks that Ukrainian soldiers are taking as they try to defend their homeland. Russia has made advances in the area around Liman, in Dobropilya, further south, where we've talked before about that brief Russian breakthrough. That has been stopped, and it appears those soldiers have refocused their efforts southwards, which was their previous focus, towards capturing Pokrovsk, which still remains despite months and months of battles in Ukrainian hands. However, Ukraine has confirmed that it started to lose territory in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, so that is around where the provinces of Dnipropetrovsk, Donetsk and Zaporizhia meet. Symbolic in a sense, because whilst there have been forays into that territory before, this is the first time that Russia appears to be making permanent gains into Dnipropetrovsk province. Other news, just quick roundup stuff that's been happening outside Ukraine, but related to Ukraine. Extraordinary events in Copenhagen in Denmark, where the American charge d'affaires, who's the acting head of the American embassy in Denmark, a man called Mark Stroh, has been summoned by the Danish Foreign Ministry over accusations that America is trying to foment unrest and a separatist movement in Greenland. And this is linked to Donald Trump's brazen claims that he wants Greenland to become part of America because he wants its mineral resources, and perhaps also wants the territory, which will prove increasingly valuable as the ice sheets melt, for access to the North Pole and possible northern sea routes, northern passages, where new shipping lanes will become available. Important for trade and inevitably important for military projection of power. Something I've also been involved in reporting this week, a massive joint NATO operation by America, Britain and Norway to track Russian submarine, or indeed Russian submarines, in the North Sea and the Norwegian Sea, possibly linked to the arrival of a US carrier strike group. America's largest aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald R. Ford, has been sailing through the North Sea into the Norwegian Sea. What we've seen is large numbers of flights by the P-8 Poseidon submarine hunting aircraft that all three of those nations use, particularly over the Norwegian Sea. We see these aircraft taking off, the Americans taking off from Iceland, the Brits taking off from, the RAF taking off from Lossiemouth in Scotland, and the Norwegians taking off from Evenes airfield inside the Arctic Circle. Many of these aircraft turn off their transponders, so we don't know exactly where they're operating, but some have kept transmitting as they've swooped low over the ocean and performed lapped in small circles for many, many hours, where they use an extraordinary array of sensors and sonar buoys, which they can drop into the ocean to try and detect Russian submarines. Based on what we've seen, those Russian submarines or submarines appear to be retreating, because these search areas have moved further north and northeast up to the top of Norway towards Russian Murmansk, where those submarines, or Severomorsk, where those submarines are based. Finally, extraordinary scenes out of the White House. It never Donald Trump never loses his ability to surprise and to shock, but a televised cabinet meeting, important for Ukraine because we saw Trump praising Putin, talking about what the two men had achieved together in the past, being critical of Zelensky. So it's massive sort of flip-flopping that is perhaps less predictable, but slightly nauseating. Well, not even slightly nauseating. I mean, absolutely sort of vomit-inducing scenes from Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump's peace envoy, who just sort of launched this extraordinary, obsequious speech to the cabinet where he said all he wants is for Trump to get a Nobel Peace Prize.
Your team is nothing short of incredible. And there's only one thing I wish for, that Nobel Committee finally gets its act together and realizes that you are the single finest candidate since the this Nobel Award was ever talked about to receive that reward. Beyond your success is game-changing out in the world today. And I hope everybody one day wakes up and realizes that.
When I was watching it, I couldn't help feeling it was like watching a scene out of a sort of Stalinist Politburo, where it is the most important job of the cabinet, instead of presenting hard truths to their leader, is simply to try and fluff that leader's ego. It was terrifying. We have also heard, though, from Finland's President Stubb, who we know is liked by Trump, that he hopes Donald Trump will grow tired of Vladimir Putin's prevarications and delaying and his lies. Don't we all? But so far, Donald Trump appears to continue to be flip-flopping, and that accusation, that taco accusation that Trump always chickens out, feels truer and truer as we wait for him to inflict any of those severe consequences on Russia, which is talked about so many times. As ever, thank you very much for your questions. If you do have any questions, please ask them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can, either in the comments or on next week's show. We've got a few to get through today. Number one, why should Russia be granted Ukrainian territory or land as a reward for its aggression? Shouldn't Ukraine's borders be respected? Well, fundamentally, absolutely yes. Ukraine's borders should be respected. Russia should not be granted land. That is the ideal situation. That is the objective. That is what Ukraine was outwardly and ostensibly fighting for all of this war since 2022, and indeed before, since 2014. There is, unfortunately, I think, a recognition that realpolitik plays a part and that it may be impossible to dislodge Russia from some of the territory it holds. What is even more extraordinary, though, is the suggestions, the demand from Putin, and the fact that these demands have even been entertained at all, is that Russia wants even more territory. It wants the territory that it hasn't been able to conquer or capture by force. And Ukraine, quite rightly, has dismissed those demands out of hand, and Ukraine's staunchest allies in Europe have insisted that Ukraine must make the decisions on territory, so they are backing President Zelensky on that. Question 2, would a fly zone not be simple to enforce, and why has that not been done a long time ago? Two parts to it. Would it be simple? It's simple in theory. It's very complicated and dangerous in practice. It does require a huge amount of effort and risk, because that would require Ukraine's NATO allies to be putting aircraft in or near Ukraine and shooting down missiles. It essentially has two main risks. There's a risk of escalation, because at which point those NATO allies, for example, or coalition of the willing allies, shoot down targets, they might find themselves in a position where they would shoot down a Russian plane before it were to launch a missile. And obviously that then has the risk of escalation, and there's also a risk that those allies providing the no-fly zone could be shot down as well. So there's that risk. Question number 2, or sort of part 2 rather, why has this not been done a long time ago? Really good question. If you live in a democracy, I'd suggest that's a question you ask your democratic representative, because fundamentally Israel's allies have shown that they are willing to shoot down missiles fired at Israel by Iran. That's America, that's France, that's Jordan, that's the United Kingdom. They have not been willing to do that over Russia. How many Challenger 2s are still operational in Ukraine? Short answer is I cannot be sure. We know that 14 were given. I have only seen evidence of 2 confirmed K kills when a Challenger is destroyed. That was one very early on in the summer counteroffensive. That was a second one during the Kursk campaign when Ukrainian forces surged into Russian Kursk province. There were unconfirmed reports of a second tank destroyed there as well, but that has not been verified by imagery. When I spoke to the Challenger crews, I've met them, I spent time with them, they've talked about some problems they've had with the Challenger's slow repair processes, but those that, tanks that have been damaged can and are being repaired. And finally, a repeat on a question asked last time: why did the war start? I answered that by saying it started because Russia launched a full-scale war of aggression. If you want to go back slightly before that, I think the reason this war started is twofold. Fundamentally, Vladimir Putin went down a historical nationalist rabbit hole where he became obsessed with the idea that Ukraine does not have the right to exist as a sovereign nation, that it is not a sovereign nation and it is rightly part of Russia. He has, we know, described the collapse of the Soviet Union as the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, and he sees it as his mission to try and rebuild Russia's former glory by sort of re-establishing the territories or bringing under control what used to be the areas of the USSR, the Soviet Union. And he often talks about Novorossiya, or New Russia, many of the territories that Catherine the Great annexed during her reign, including, for example, Kherson and Crimea. The other factor, Ukraine was pivoting away from Russia and towards Europe. Ukrainians didn't want the past that Russia had offered them. They didn't want the economic stagnation, the corruption, the problems. They wanted the opportunities which they saw in the European Union. And fundamentally, Russia couldn't countenance having a Europhile government in Kyiv. Thank you very much for your questions. As ever, do ask them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time. We're in a Ukrainian armoured vehicle and we're heading towards the Russian border.